Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Heinz History Center, I'm Leslie Sibilic. I'm Senior Curator here at the Heinz History Center. Can we just say how thrilled we are to see so many people here today? I know we had a great crowd this morning at the event in the library and archives. And I'm going to run through a few program details before we get started with this talk. But thank you so much to all of you who have made it here today. We are excited to see so many people. We shouldn't have been surprised, but to be reminded of so many people who love this history. And what I want to say first is there are events going on throughout this building. This talk, this is really the first of our main speaker series events here in the Muller Gallery. After this talk, there will be about an hour break until 2 p.m. when Rick Seebeck will be doing his program, That Kennywood Summer. But in the meantime, please remember that there are activities going on in multiple other floors of the building. Make sure if you're interested in cooking and ethnic cooking demonstrations that you check out the event. There will be an Eastern European cooking demo on the 3rd floor. That's in the Weiss Broad Kitchen. There will be another showing of the Dietrich Library and Archives event on Kennywood and the Parchives. One of the really important things that we've done here is that the Dietrich Library and Archives has preserved the Kennywood collection. That's photographs, documents, ledgers. It is a truly unique collection, and that will give you another chance, if you didn't catch their program this morning, to take a look at that. We also have in the Campbell Gallery on the 4th floor, many of the art of the authors who will be talking in the panels later this afternoon will be doing their books signings there. So if you want to check that out, make sure you stop on the 4th floor. They'll be there until 2. And also, I have to say, especially if you have little ones with you, on the 3rd floor, back behind Discovery Place, there is an arcade of carnival games. And I think there's a number of different things that people will enjoy. So please check that out as well. And since you all had to come through the Great Hall, I'm sure you saw the activities that are going on down there. So again, thank you so much for being here. And a special thank you. I am really thrilled to welcome Lauren Rabinovitz, Emeritus Professor of American Studies and Cinematic Arts at the University of Iowa, to our stage today for our first speaker. You know, she has been working with amusement park pop culture events explorations for many, many years. She's been working on this idea of American amusement parks, the industry and connections to modernism, to technology, and how it introduced these subjects to American audiences. She was working on kind of early experimental CD-ROM programs funded through an NEH grant back in the 1990s and early 2000s. That project was called Yesteryear's Wonderland, Introducing Modernism to America. Complicated story that she might or might not go into, but she's been working with this subject for many, many years. And she also published the book, and I'm going to show you a copy here. Electric Dreamland, Amusement Parks, Movies, and American Modernity, issued by Columbia University Press in 2012. Again, looking at this larger question of how did Americans interact with early technology? What role did amusement parks play beyond kind of the early focus on, a lot of scholars tended to focus on Coney Island as this one entity. There was a lot of research material there, but she is focused beyond that. So we're really fortunate that she is the first of our scholars who is going to be talking today. And I have to say, for the History Center, we also need to acknowledge that Lauren is, ironically, she, in the course of her research, prior to those records ever coming here, did have a chance to look at some of the Kennywood Park archives and was one of the people who graciously wrote a letter of support when we put in our National Endowment for the Humanities grant to work on underwriting the processing and digitization of those collections. And her letter of support was part of the project that successfully got us awarded that funding. And for that, we are deeply grateful to you. So we owe her a debt of gratitude here for starters. And I have to say that the other thing is that there's so many of her research areas that really dovetail things that we love to research here at the History Center. While her amusement park work is the primary focus of her topic today, she is also really interested in aspects of food and popular culture. She is currently working on a couple different projects. First, a 40-chapter encyclopedia, kind of the history, the encyclopedia history of American popular culture from Cambridge University Press, which will include chapters on things like amusement parks, Walt Disney and theme parks. And then she's also working on a book, and it's a tentative title, I know, but it's a great title, Cooking Madness, Pop Culture's Obsession with Food. And for those of us sitting in this building today with the neon ketchup bottle on our roof, and everybody here, I'm sure, thinking about ethnic cooking and Kennywood Park fries, I think you can see how her research interests dovetail so well with us, both Kennywood and Heinz. I mean, you can't get a better combination than that. So without further ado on my end, please join me in welcoming Lauren Urbanovitz to the stage.
Well, Leslie, thank you for that gracious introduction. And I also want to thank a few other thank yous to Matt Strauss, director of the Heinz History Center, for extending this invitation, to Emily Ruby and Liz Dorr, who helped make all of this possible. And so I've got a few other thank yous. Let's kind of start her off here. I like this kind of get in the mood music. Not gonna play much of it. But I also want to extend some thank yous to some local people, two of whom are guests today. Hold on a second. For helping me collect the images that you're going to see for the next half hour. Pittsburgh has, I think, more people interested in amusement parks and collecting things related to amusement parks and digging into the history of amusement parks than any other city in the United States. And as Leslie was talking about, okay, Liz, I got some troubles here. Modern technology, I'm better with turn of the century technology. This whole thing is, all right. Okay, I think, can you hear me okay? Okay, I think we're set. Leslie talked about the Kennywood papers that they got, and you have no idea how important it is that they rescue these papers, and it really was a rescue. When Jim Futrell initially got me into Kennywood in 1999 to look at those papers, they were in a file cabinet closet in a small administrative office, and it was April, and we go in to access them, and they're in cardboard boxes sitting in like 4 or 5 inches of water. And nothing was sorted, nothing was organized, and I was trying to kind of dig through them and find out about the history of the company and what they had accomplished in their first couple decades. And I just sat there thinking, these papers are doomed. I mean, the company is not going to take care of them. They're going to die. And there are no other collections like that in the United States. So a big thanks to the Heinz History Center for literally rescuing them and not only having them for historians and all others who are interested, but putting a lot of them online so they're accessible to any one of us. That's a round of applause. Okay, so Kennywood is and always has been special, not just to Pittsburgh and to the steelworkers who were its earliest patrons, but to the country as a whole. Now, my goal today is not to detail Kennywood's chronological history. There are a couple panels later today that will talk much more fully about Kennywood and its past. But I want to talk about the importance and the context of amusement parks built at the turn of the 20th century. Kennywood was one of more than 1,500 amusement parks erected in the United States between 1895 and 1918. Big cities like New York and Chicago each had 6 amusement parks. Philadelphia had a whopping 7. Pittsburgh had 5. Kennywood, Westview, working out. The short-lived Luna Park, Coney Island for only 2 years. I don't have a slide of that one, on what is today Neville Island, and Dream City in Wilkinsburg. Amusement parks represented a new type of energized relaxation. They taught Americans to revel in new technologies, to enjoy the hyperstimulation and nervous energy of newly industrialized cities, and to delight in the mechanical rhythms and motion that the parks offer. Here and across the country, electric streetcar and interurban railroad companies built amusement parks at the end of their lives. It's a well-known fact here in Pittsburgh that the Monongahela Street Railway Company started Kennywood, but that phenomenon was widespread. In Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company built White City Park. That was in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood, and they built Willow Grove at the end of their northern city line. In Reading, Lancaster, Harrisburg, Allentown, and Erie, local trolley companies started amusement parks. Such companies across the United States had 2 things in common. 1, they had electric service, and 2, they had plenty of cheap land at their barns located at the outskirts of towns. They only needed to break even on their park revenues so long as the parks promoted train ridership, especially during hours that were not rush hour. The original catalyst, though, for the amusement park, for the American amusement park, was the 1893 Chicago Columbian World's Exposition, the Midway there. That was the fun or amusement zone at that World's Fair. The Midway's exotic foreign shows and its massive Ferris wheel inspired entrepreneurial showmen to mimic the Midway style and success in longer lasting entertainment venues. It didn't take long after that World's Fair closed for more permanent parks to open in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and other American cities. Amusement parks also borrowed from other traditions and cheap entertainments. 19th century parks and gardens often served as forerunners. Those parks, existing parks, simply added mechanical attractions, live theater, moving pictures, and pyrotechnical displays. Kennywood began as just such a picnic grove named after its landowner, Anthony Kenny. Many parks across the United States were named Coney Island or Luna Park after their New York models. Pittsburgh's Luna Park and its front gate, there's a period picture of it, is the model for Kennywood's Lost Kennywood today. And here you can see what a good reproduction they did as they see them side by side. And the park lasted for only 4 years, the original. But also Johnstown and Scranton also had Luna Parks. White City amusement parks named after the Chicago 1893 World's Fair also appeared from coast to coast. Other park names conjured up the fantastic or the prosaic, like Wilkes-Barre's Sans Souci Park, which means not a care. Some parks intimated they were romantic settings in nature, like Philadelphia's Willow Grove, or Erie's Waldemar Park. Waldemar is in German, or Woods by the Sea. There were also wonderlands, dreamlands, joylands, fairylands. There were parks named after their locations, their contractors, and their landowners. There were even parks just quite simply called Electric Park, including this one, which is was just outside of Scranton. Turn of the century amusement parks were not only plentiful, but they were popular. Parks in booming railroad and industrial cities like Pittsburgh could count on high Sunday and holiday attendance. Okay, so what were these parks? Amusement parks featured mechanical thrill rides, games of chance, dance halls, roller skating rinks, band concerts, disaster shows, or pyrodramas as they were called. I'll get into that in a little bit. Ethnographic exhibits, or actually living villages of non-white peoples. Motion pictures. Food and drink. And swimming. The architecture of the parks often provided fanciful, exotic backdrops. Often had electrified, lighted towers and gates, boldly painted facades, brilliant flags waving, and vividly colored gardens. Barkers lured customers to different attractions, while gramophone music, bands, mechanical pianos, and orchestras filled the air. And I should say here, by the way, from this amazing collection of postcard images that I have, I've tried to bring in Pennsylvania images as much as possible. So the phenomena I'm talking about were nationwide, but I thought it'd be more fun here to kind of look at Pennsylvania as often as we could. The parks displayed visual and auditory excitement, new mechanical technologies, and crowds of people. Amusement parks helped to define a new concept of urban modernism. The celebration of motion and speed, the beauty of industrial technologies, and the experience of the crowd. Their modernity lay not in their styles of architecture, but in their sensory overstimulation, their bombardment and exaggeration of sight, sound, motion. While the park's dynamic landscape featured the continual din of people and machinery in motion, and electrically powered visual spectacle, two mechanical attractions initially stood out. The Shoot the Chutes water slide and the circle swing. The Shoot the Chutes water slide actually swept people in boats down a track onto a large rectangular pool, usually in the park center. A steep incline, the speed of the descent, the bumpy ride, and the splashing waves made the chutes the park's most thrilling ride. And if you're having trouble imagining it, this is from 1903. This is actually Dreamland at Coney Island. I love the fact we'll get to see it, that you not only come flying down this descent, but there's like that's on the incline, there's a conveyor that hoists your boat back up. Watch one more come down. There they go. All right, we'll go on to the circle or the aerial swing, was a high tower whose radial arms each suspended a gondola or a passenger carriage. When the whole device was mechanically rotated, the cars spun outward. Circle swings were often the fastest ride at the park. It actually wasn't until the 1920s when roller coasters developed the speed and braking efficiency to become the new heart of amusement parks as we think of them today. At the turn of the century, roller coasters were called switchback or scenic railways, sometimes called figure eights, sometimes leap the dips, sometimes racing coasters, or this was called the flip-flap railroad. And it's pretty obvious what this thing does, but here it is. Wait for it, it'll come. And that was the flip-flap railroad. These rides depended upon railway apparatus. That's pretty obvious. But that was a technology not understood the same way then as we think of it today. Railway passengers actually felt ambivalent about train travel. Stories of streetcar and railroad crashes and deaths regularly filled the front pages of newspapers. Urban railroads, trolleys, and even subways, the very transportation that brought the park goer to the gate, was at worst unsafe and at best dirty and uncertain. All these thrill rides momentarily disoriented the rider, provided a novel perspective, amplified unfamiliar spatial relations, and heightened all their cognitive sensations. One of the first historians to take amusement parks seriously was John Casson, who in 1978 described it pretty well. He said riders could enjoy their momentary fright because they knew it would turn into comic relief. They could engage in what appeared dangerous adventure because ultimately they believed in its safety. By seemingly defying the forces of gravity and or offering unaccustomed speed, thrill rides affirmed the instant is euphoric. A quote I like even better than that is from a poet in 1901 who said, "The amusement park's specialty is to toss, tumble, jerk, jounce, jolt, and jostle you by means of a variety of mechanical contrivances until your digestion is where your reason ought to be, and your reason has gone no one knows whither." If the same thing happened to you the next day on a trolley car, you would in all probability sue the company for $1,000, which was a lot of money back then. The amusement park addressed a new perceptual orientation and anxieties about the evolution of the technological world by ameliorating them at a very concrete level in one's body. In addition to mechanical rides, parks depended upon a steady diet of changing shows. Kennywood was no exception there. Since park owners couldn't regularly swap out mechanical attractions, they needed a continual stream of motion pictures, animal tricks, daredevil stunts, and other performances to produce the variety that would keep parkgoers coming back regularly to their parks. For example, Kennywood offered Pawnee Bill's historic Wild West show in the early 1900s. That was a traveling Wild West show that featured jugglers, cowboys, sharpshooters, and Mexicans, as well as Native Americans. Among the most popular live attractions, shows of dancing girls featured women dancing in sexually suggestive fashion. They claimed to be demonstrating authentic dances from the Middle East and India. They featured sensual, sexy wriggling unseen outside cheap theaters. But in their assertive sexual gestures and skimpy outfits by Western standards, these women represented the Middle East and Asia as more sexually open and at the time, therefore, much less civilized than the United States and Europe. The dancers, however, were not Indian or Middle Eastern. They were American girls wearing wigs, makeup, and costume. And for me, this is the most amazing, rare discovery. Princess O'Mani, who danced at a St. Louis Park theater for a number of years, basically she was Nan Aspinwall from Nebraska, from a Nebraska rural farm, and went to St. Louis looking for work. And this was her first job for several years. Now, archives generally did not save the scrapbooks of dancing showgirls of 100 and some years ago because they weren't deemed important enough to preserve. But Nan Aspinwall met her husband, Dan Gable, on the vaudeville circuit because during the winter when the amusement parks were closed, she took her dancing act to a vaudeville traveling group, and she met Dan Gable there. He was a sharpshooter. He taught her to be a sharpshooter. And so when they got married, she gave up Princess O'Mani, although she had all these scrapbooks about Princess O'Mani, and she became Two Gun Nan. And so for a while on the vaudeville circuit, she would come out and act 4 as Princess O'Mani and do her sexy dance, go backstage, take off the wig, put on a cowgirl outfit, and come out in Act 7 as Two Gun Nan doing sharpshooter tricks. And I always found it amazing that I was able to like track this stuff down because usually there aren't any remnants left of it. So these dances that they did became known as hoochie coochie or simply cooch dances, and they were really designed to please and excite the male patrons. Now I have an example from a dancer named Ella Lola, 1898. And this is a rendition of her dance, which would have been considered very risque by 1898 standards. That would be skimpy dress by 1898 standards. If there are any kids here, don't worry about covering their eyes. But this would have been sort of X-rated 100 years, more than 100 years ago. And watch, this is where. Oh. So that's what a belly dance looked like in 1898. As you can see, you get to see her legs, right? Actually. Youngsters, though, of theatrical spectacle at amusement parks resided in the park's disaster shows and pyrodramas. These shows, which were an amalgam of theater, circus, modern panoramas, pyrotechnics shows, and magic tricks, were the largest scale, most multi-sensory spectacle of the period. Such colossal performances required large outdoor amphitheaters. They utilized ornately decorated stage sets, moving scrolls or panoramas as backdrops. They employed casts of hundreds, and they depended on special effects and fireworks. Since these shows were costly to produce and they required big spaces and casts, they usually occurred more frequently at large amusement parks in major cities. Shows like the Last Days of Pompeii or the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack played out historical reenactments. Others recreated contemporary disasters like the slides you've just seen. City tenement fires was a popular subject, but also major floods and the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In a single day at Coney Island in New York, you could witness Rome and Moscow burn, you could attend several naval battles, and you could watch Galveston flood. You could also see San Francisco quake and Vesuvius erupt. Whether a historical reenactment or an illustration of modern urban dangers, the disaster show depended not on individual heroes, but on the awesome sight of apocalyptic fury produced by mechanical apparatus and pyrotechnics. All right, let's switch subjects a little bit. And let's talk about segregation at the turn of the century part. While amusement parks were a national phenomenon, they didn't uniformly extend their offerings to all citizens of a given metropolitan area. Once segregation became sanctioned by the US Supreme Court in 1896, Southern parks formally instituted whites-only policies. They either announced outright that they were only for whites, or they sometimes ran separate late autumn seasons for African Americans. In the North, amusement parks practiced de facto segregation, wherein they just quietly adopted exclusionary practices, except on special days, often called Jim Crow days. Cleveland's Luna Park, Baltimore's Riverview, and Chicago's White City all advertised their Jim Crow days in their local newspapers. But even on those days, bathing facilities, swimming pools, bathhouses, beaches were all off limits. Amusement parks may have drawn a wide swath of the American public, but they were not necessarily experienced the same by everyone. However, there were also many, as they were called, colored-only amusement parks in both the North and South. Sometimes African-American parks sat adjacent to a white park, but more often African-American parks were at the end of a city trolley line for the same reason as their white counterparts. Local trolley companies wanted to stimulate fares on routes through Black neighborhoods too. Occasionally, like this example, African-American businessmen built and operated amusement parks. At African-American parks, swimming pools and exhibition baseball games were central features, since those were the period's most popular recreations that otherwise excluded African-Americans. Parks also incorporated tactics for separating customers by class. For example, at Willow Grove in Philadelphia, celebrity conductor John Philip Sousa appeared regularly and doubled or even tripled park attendance. His orchestral entertainment of marches and light classical music contrasted the band concerts of cakewalks, ragtime, and ballads popular at Chestnut Hill Park, a mere 7 miles away from Willow Grove. Kennywood likewise featured popular brass band concerts for its working class audience of steelworkers and their families. A trolley industry trade newspaper applauded this class separation. I don't know if you can see that, because with the sunshine, with the light shining in, but it says, "We support providing cheaper amusements in one resort, while the better class of entertainments that appeal to the higher grade of patrons may be maintained in an entirely separate place. In general, we do not believe it is wise to attempt to make people of widely different types, socially and intellectually, mix in amusement parks." Higher class parks like Willow Grove also relied upon electrical illuminations or fireworks shows combined with illuminated fountains and living statue displays. And these were considered more aesthetically uplifting entertainment. Such spectacles promised artistic value to the middle-class audiences who were critical of cheap sensations. Some parks thus transcended categorization as vulgar entertainment, whereas others got labeled tawdry, vice-filled places. Instead of being laboratories for democracy, as a number of historians have claimed, amusement parks flourished because they developed strategies for maintaining social divisions of race and class. Inside the park's gates, attractions were also organized so that immigrant and working classes spent their time differently from the middle class. Some park attractions charged more money to attract a higher class crowd. And when we think today of the concept of one entrance fee that allows you free access to all the attractions, that's a post-World War II feature. These amusement parks, you pay separately for every single thing you went to. Motion picture theaters also help to differentiate classes. Theaters adjacent to beer gardens and cafes that allowed alcohol consumption during their shows could expect a more working class patronage. Additionally, the type of movie exhibited was important. Travelogues attracted a higher class of patron than did Westerns and melodramas. Multiple movie theaters drew different audiences to different parts of the park, thereby rearranging the crowds into more homogeneous social groups. Such a hierarchical notion of parkgoers shored up rather than broke down class, racial, and ethnic divisions. Okay, let's talk about how amusement parks became important in modern urban culture. They also stimulated a new focus on moral values. And I think it's easy to forget this today. In an era of mass immigration and migration from rural areas to newly industrialized cities, social workers especially worried about young people, young men and women, away from their families and religious communities for the first time, and without a moral compass to navigate the many sinful temptations that cities offered. Amusement parks landed squarely on the radar of social workers, Protestant ministers, and temperance movement activists. Most parks served beer and had gambling casinos, but their response to the criticism of these attractions, though, was not uniform. Some banned alcohol and gambling and billed themselves as family parks. Others chose to ignore the protests and the boycotts of social reformers and temperance leaders. Reformers also condemned what they called cheap sensations, contributing to the relaxation of Victorian codes of conduct and what they regarded as immoral sexual behavior. Even Jane Addams, the country's most famous social worker, social reformer, believed that amusement parks led to sexual promiscuity and female immorality. She says here, looping the loop amid shrieks of stimulated terror or dancing in disorderly saloon halls are perhaps the natural reactions to a day spent in noisy factories and in trolley cars whirling through the distracting street. But the city, which permits them to be the acme of pleasure and recreation to its young people, commits a grievous mistake. Now, reformers even viewed a ride as seemingly innocuous today as Kennywood's Old Mill, a boat ride through darkened tunnels, as an immoral excuse for sexual contact. Said one social worker at the time, temptations of personal intimacy are especially aggravated here by the ease with which the innocent, under multiplied and insistent suggestions, can be reduced into intoxication and immorality in the space of a few hours, and the whole gamut of illicit relations foisted upon them. Even an old-fashioned slide, again, seems pretty innocuous today. It likewise offered opportunities for illicit voyeurism. A fact noted by the painter John Sloan on his trip to Coney Island. Where he says, crowds watch the people coming down the slide in Luna Park. Lingerie displays bring a roar of natural vulgar mirth. And let me show you that in action. So we have a gathering of men, this was sort of typical, at the bottom of the slide, waiting to catch a glimpse of underwear and legs. And unfortunately, in this example, they get so distracted by the camera that we don't get a real perfect view of it. But this was what you could expect at this kind of a ride. Again, we don't really think of slides as sexy, but okay. Thus, because of these kinds of things that I've just laid out, social leaders generally branded amusement parks a national perversion. Let's talk about what happened to the old parks. Besides Kennywood, only a handful of parks can claim 125 years or so of entertainment. The other long-living parks are Ohio Cedar Point. I'm assuming that's close enough that somebody may have been there. Denver's Lakeside, which is near where I live. Santa Cruz's Boardwalk. Rochester's Seabreeze. And Connecticut's Lake Complex. Now, you may have noticed I left out a few because in Pennsylvania, Allentown's Dorney Park, Erie's Waldemere Park, has some families here, obviously, Altoona's Lakemont Park, and Hershey's Hershey Park share Kennywood's longevity. And I hope this afternoon that the panel that has spent their time studying local amusement parks can help explain why so many of these parks still exist in Pennsylvania and not in the rest of the country. Most amusement parks built at the turn of the century went out of business before or during the Depression in the 1930s. Various factors led to their demise, but devastating fires were often a major cause. Probably the best known amusement park fire was the 1911 one at Coney Island's Dreamland. The park burnt to the ground and was never rebuilt. 2 days later, fire broke out at the opposite end of the country in San Francisco's Schutz Park, killing 4 people and many animals. Other parks routinely experience fires. In Pennsylvania alone, Pittsburgh's Luna Park burnt in 1909, Scranton's Luna Park burnt in 1916, Bristol's Burlington Island Park burnt in 1934. Kennywood was lucky. It actually had a major fire in 1911, but the fire did not force permanent closure. Amusement parks were not immune to other disasters. Flooding, tornadoes, earthquakes, all damaged parks and sometimes destroyed them completely. Amusement parks may have been so vulnerable to flooding because many early ones were located on river islands or shores of rivers and beaches. After regular flooding, their owners and local civic authorities decided to use the land instead for greater flood control of their cities. Of course, many parks closed for reasons other than burning to the ground, becoming submerged underwater, or being blown down. By the 1920s, trolley company owners realized as cities expanded that selling their increasingly valuable land, their real estate, was more profitable than maintaining parks simply to sell train tickets. In addition, the street railway companies themselves were being reorganized as public utility companies, and their land assets were being sold off. The sagging economy of the 1930s further forced older parks out of business. Before the Depression, there were approximately 400 amusement parks across North America, but most closed in the 1930s. The few trolley parks that survived the Depression did not last long either. After World War II, as white middle-class citizens fled cities for new suburbs, the parks in old neighborhoods acquired new reputations as urban habitats of decay. They became sites of juvenile gang violence, illegal drug traffic, and racial conflicts. The paint peeled, facades seemed shabby and outdated, and infrastructures aged beyond repair. Owners face difficulties competing with newer modern theme parks being built adjacent new freeways on the outskirts of growing metropolitan areas. And this was certainly the case for one of your favorites here, Westview Park. Westview relied upon streetcar service rather than automobiles to bring customers to its gates. But by the mid-1960s, Pittsburgh discontinued the trolley service due to declining use. In addition, Westview depended on Danceland, its dance hall, to attract crowds of young people. But in the 1960s and 1970s, popular music acts opted for arenas and convention centers rather than going to old-fashioned dance halls. An outdated Danceland burnt to the ground in 1973. It was not rebuilt, and Westview closed a few years later from declining income. Wilkes Barre's Sans Souci closed in 1969. Philadelphia's Willow Grove closed in 1976. Lancaster's Rocky Springs suffered financial failure in 1981. Scranton's Rocky Glen closed in 1987. Only a few parks as old as Kennywood have survived. Even Kennywood wasn't immune to the historical forces that destroyed other parks. Kennywood had fallen into disrepair like so many other old parks, but received new injections of capital, updated modern thrill rides, and new entertainment so it can rival newer parks. Kennywood has also acknowledged its past through historical plaques placed next to old buildings and rides. Kennywood received National Historic Register status in 1987, the first amusement park to be thus commemorated. While numerous other roller coasters and carousels across the country are on the National Register, only Kennywood and Rye, New York's Playland, built much later in 1928, are full-sized working parks on the register. Kennywood even historicized its founding era as part of the park itself in Lost Kennywood. These memorials ensure recognition of Kennywood's past, a history about a society that no longer exists, but shaped our present. The rise and fall of amusement parks in the United States is not the only story there is to tell about amusement parks. Amusement parks were key American culture, popular culture, exported around the world decades before Walt Disney opened theme parks in Paris, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Historians often credit Buffalo Bill's Wild West show's European tours in the 1880s and 1890s as the first exported American pop culture. Hollywood movies' global domination by the end of World War I cemented the trend. But amusement parks, on a second, my pages are stuck together. Amusement parks helped power the global ascendancy of American popular culture, and a Pittsburgh native played a major role. Some of you probably already know the story of Frederick Ingersoll, the Pittsburgh amusement park developer and ride manufacturer. He built not only the Luna Parks in Pennsylvania and other American locales, but abroad in Paris and 7 other European cities, Bombay, Buenos Aires, Honolulu, Melbourne, and Mexico City. Other American ride manufacturers followed his lead. They made international markets their prime target once they had saturated the American one. And I have to say here is a kind of crazy, ironic footnote. Ingersoll's fortunes went up and down during his life, and then his health was deteriorating as well. And he actually died by committing suicide at an amusement park. At Frug Park in Omaha, he locked himself in a concession and turned on the gas, and they found him the next morning. He didn't own that park. I don't know why. I don't know if he left a note, but it's a sad end to an important and very interesting career. Anyway, and his Ingersoll's parks around the world became synonymous with the Americanness of amusement parks. And this stands today to honor his memory. Whether in the United States or abroad, amusement parks promoted technological utopianism and giving one's body over to new machines for an affect of wonderment. They helped to usher in and make sense of industrial modernity, its railroads, electricity, new patterns and types of labor and leisure across a wide-ranging heterogeneous American population. The amusement park outfitted citizens for a new world through the reassurances of fantasy. By dazzling its participants as a technological spectacle, the amusement park helped win popular consent to the new mass society. So happy 125th birthday, Kennywood.
We will have some time for a little bit of Q&A, so we'll give Lauren a tip to get another drink of water, and I think there are two of us, there will be mics floating around both sides here. We welcome some questions.
Why didn't you cover Idlewild?
Why didn't I? Oh, I do know Iowa. I lived in Iowa for 35 years. And Iowa, actually, I covered in my book. I didn't cover it here because I thought I was guessing that the audience would be. Oh,
I see the Idlewild Park over in Lady.
oh, okay. I thought you meant the state of Iowa. See, that's where my brain went. I don't know very well. When was it built? Older than Kennywood? I have not. I mean, I don't know about it. I guess I'm ignorant. So I don't. And it's in Pittsburgh?
No, outside of Pittsburgh.
I did not. I mean, I did not find it in my research, I will have to say.
That's okay, but thanks for everything else.
Well, thank you. I will say, I've been discussing this with a couple other people over the last 24 hours. When I started doing research on my book in 1999. We didn't live in quite the same digital world back then that we do now. And access to finding out about over 1,500 parks in the United States, I quickly had to decide that I wasn't going to be able to, get profiles on every single one. It would mean traveling to local historical societies, and I'd still be doing that. And that I was looking for national patterns and some of the range of parks in big cities, small towns, and trying to establish a national phenomenon. And I especially wanted to do that again at that time and up until when I published the book, because as Leslie said, all the work on amusement parks, or most of it, was on Coney Island. And I thought Coney Island was a terrible representation of what parks were like around the country. And it is. It's not typical. It's not typical of a lot of the rest of the country. And also I became very intrigued by the fact that big cities and even small towns, a lot of small towns had parks that were called electric park. They weren't as big as like Kennywood or Westview or Luna Park, but they still had all the basics. And so whether you were a rural inhabitant or lived in a city, you could experience an amusement park in either place. And again, historians have often talked about that era and talked about all of these changes in terms of electricity and train technologies, and talked about urban citizens as kind of getting connected to that, and that somehow people in rural areas were left behind. And I wanted to like disprove that even if you lived on a farm in a rural area like the state of Iowa, you had access to a nearby amusement park, which is probably the first place you ever saw electricity. And that you saw electricity as this incredible visual phenomenon, and that it powered these fun mechanical rides. And so rapidly, the amusement park really kind of created a spread of a new way of relating to and thinking about the changing world. I was interested in proving that. And then I do leave it to the people who will be talking later this afternoon and people in other cities who are far better than I am at documenting the specific history in their own region of when the park started, what they did, and how they evolved over time. So I am not perfect on some of those kinds of things. And even now, when I look at the National Park Directory at the end of my book that I created, there are question marks on dates started and dates ended that you can now go to the internet and look that information up, which was not there when I first did this. That's a long answer that doesn't answer the question, except kind of goes around it.
I just want to thank you for bringing these beautiful vintage films to us and these postcards. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. In gratitude for the films and the postcards, let me say two things. Again, when I started these films, which there are some others as well, not too many, they were very rare. They're owned by the Library of Congress, but nobody saw them. You had no access to them. If you want to see them again, look them up on the internet. And they're at the Library of Congress website, but you can do a search and you can see them as many times as you want on YouTube. But again, we live in a different world. And the postcards, I owe everything to postcard collectors who shared their collections with me.
So we'll take a couple more quick questions and then we have one other event to do here. I know there's a lot going on in the building, so.
My quick question is with over here. So a lot of the types of rides you talked about still have some preservation and some, they're still popular today, dark rides, and that kind of stuff. But it seems like shows have lost a lot of popularity even today. Do you think there's a reason, just like in a broader sense, why shows and multi-sensory experience outside of fireworks really have lost that luster? Even
Movies. Hollywood. That kind of, I think, fits more into a history of vaudeville and why did that kind of entertainment die? And historians of vaudeville basically say that vaudeville died out in the 1920s and 1930s because movies took over. And both in the popular imagination, but also the business itself of moving people and acts around. So many of the shows that went to amusement parks were not permanent. Sometimes they were, like Princess O'Mani worked at the same park all summer, but then she would do the vaudeville circuit in the winter. But a lot of the parks were part of the vaudeville circuit, so that entertainment would come through on a rotating basis, and they were part of that industry, and the whole issue of the movies got bigger and bigger too, and also started to incorporate color by the 1930s. So it changed the future of live entertainment generally.
Okay, I hate to do it, but we need to cut off Q&A. We have one other event to kind of do here before we shift to other things, but Lauren will be here. And for those of you, if you have a question, you didn't have a chance to ask it, maybe she'll hang around in the back for a few minutes and you can talk personally back here. We would like to, of course, as a part of every special day, there are things that must happen here in Pittsburgh. And we would now like to introduce to you Ricky Spacuzza, who's the Assistant General Manager at Kennywood Park. And Bob Macy, Allegheny County Council Representative for District 9, who has a special document to present. And I will let them take the stage from there.
Hi, everyone. Well, wow, thank you. This is such an honor for me to even be a part of Kennywood's 125th anniversary. It's Kennywood's a legacy brand in Pittsburgh. Kennywood is Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh is Kennywood. And I'm so glad to be with this park and here today. And we have Bob Macy here, who's a big supporter of Kennywood. And I thank you for coming out for us, Bob. But man, it's great to see the last presentation on all the old things that you used to see in the park. Although I don't think we're going to put in one of those train track loopy things anytime soon. But Kennywood does a great job of mixing the old with the new. And it's great to look back at these old photos and videos and you can still see a lot of things that look pretty close to they used to 100+ years ago. So thank you for your support. And I'm glad to be here. I'm going to turn it over to Bob here, who has a lot of whereas to say here.
Well, first of all, it's an honor and privilege to be here, and I'm glad some of you all stayed. And I was just curious, how many of you all been to Kennywood? All right, that looks good. And I'd like to thank the Heinz History Center and Andy Masick for providing this venue and also providing all of the history of Kennywood. The only thing is, what I'm missing right now is where's the cotton candy and the potato patch fries?
Down there.
Okay, we got cotton candy done. No potato patch fries. Well, as you heard, I'm an Allegheny County councilman. I represent 94,000 people in the Mon Valley. And when we find an organization, an individual who has attained certain goals and certain anniversaries, we want to recognize them because we find them to be very, very essential to the overall health and well-being of our economy as well as our communities. So, whereas overlooking the Mon Valley on 80 acres in the West Mifflin, the historic Kennywood Amusement Park has long been a fun-filled destination for 125 years. And whereas in 1898, the Monongahela Street Railways Company, partially owned by Andrew Mellon, leased the land from the Kenny family to create a trolley park at the end of their line. Built on the site of the French and Indian Wars battle of the Monongahela, the park was designed by architect George S. Davidson and opened as a trolley park on May 30th, 1899. Original attractions included a carousel, which is still there, a casino building, and a dance pavilion. Whereas in 1906, Andrew S. Muskegon, along with partners Frederick W. Henniger and A.F. Megan, leased and operated the park as Kennywood Park Limited, which owned and operated Kennywood as a family business for over 100 years. Kennywood was then purchased by California-based Palace Entertainment in 2007. And whereas Kennywood designated a historical landmark in 1987, is one of the only 2 amusement parks in the United States to be given that designation. Kennywood is also only one of 13 trolley parks and operating in the country to this day. Whereas founded as a recreational playground far away from the hustle, bustle, and smog, darn it, of Pittsburgh, Kennywood became a destination for working class people, families, and served as a place of amusement for mill workers and their families. The park grew in the first half of the century into a popular attraction that can combine thrill rides, a swimming pool, and dance halls. Whereas labeled as a record-breaking amusement park, Kennywood Racer, built in 1910, was the largest racing wooden roller coaster in the world when it was built. Kiddieland, a staple of Kennywood, was one of the first children's ride areas in the world. In 1975, Kennywood added their first $1 million ride, the Log Jammer. And then Kennywood opened the fastest coaster in the world in 1993, the Steel Phantom. Whereas the Roaring '20s led to the construction of Kennywood's most iconic attractions, the Rabbit, Jackrabbit, the Thunderbolt, which is celebrating 55 years, and the Racer. All these roller coasters have been named landmark coasters by the American coaster enthusiasts. And whereas known for its slogan, America's finest amusement park, Kennywood features a nostalgic atmosphere and supported by a local fan base. Kennywood has been featured in various television shows, movies, literature, songs, and documents. It has also become a popular place for schools to hold their annual picnics. And whereas Kennywood's success is attributed to the park's continuation to keep a balance of change and preservation of traditional. Currently, Kennywood has over 40 rides, with the Old Mill as Kennywood's oldest outstanding ride at more than 115 years. Sorry. Kennywood changed the theme often. It became the Fairyland Floats, Panama Canal, Rapids George, Garfield's Nightmare, and is now back at the original name, the Old Mill, restoring the retro Western theme that has always been remembered. And whereas since 2011, Kennywood annually hosts a Christmas light show known as the Holiday Lights, where the park is decked out in the Christmas lights, including the tallest Christmas tree in Pennsylvania. Every Halloween since 2002, the park hosts a record-winning Phantoms Night, and which is named among USA Today's best theme park Halloween events in the country and amusement. Today's Golden Ticket Awards list of the Halloween theme parks events. The park has also been rated as a favorite park attraction, favorite dark attraction park by the Dark Ride and Funhouse enthusiast, Dark Side. Whereas this year, the park continues to improve with exciting new experiments, such as the newest ride, this Spin-O-Vision, which is the first multi-action spin ride of its kind in the United States. Kennywood also partners with Primanti Brothers. You all know what Primanti Brothers is. Restaurant to create the ultimate fan and guest experience with its first year at the amusement park. Whereas Kennywood has been part of Pittsburgh's history for 125 years, providing a place of amusement and beautifully blends rich history with new thrills. Now, therefore, be it resolved that Rich Fitzgerald and all of County Council would like to congratulate Kennywood Amusement Park upon the tremendous occasion of its 125-year anniversary and wants to thank Kennywood Amusement Park for its dedication to their community. Thank you all for putting up with, listening to me. And I think it's a great honor that Kennywood has received throughout this country. And we are, remember, a national park now. I live in West Mifflin, and there's two things you don't do. You don't fool around in a park, and you don't fool around with Kennywood Park. Thank you.